Hello and welcome to Inside Exercise. I'm Emeritus Professor Glenn McConnell from Victoria University in Australia, and I'm also currently a Danish Diabetes and Endocrine Academy visiting professor at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. The idea behind Inside Exercise is to bring to you the absolute who's who of exercise research, so exercise physiology, exercise metabolism, and exercise and health. And what I'm wanting is for you to get your exercise information from the research experts rather than from influencers. And indeed, today I bring to you Professor Ylva Hellsten from the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. She's an expert on cardiovascular function and exercise. So we talked a lot about the effect of acute exercise, so just one bout on blood flow and blood pressure, etc. Also the effect of chronic exercise, so exercise training on blood pressure and blood vessel function. She's done a lot of work looking at the effect of aging on vascular function, so on blood vessel function. She finds that about half of the reduction in your blood vessel function is from inactivity and half is from aging. So we talked a lot about how important it is to remain active and to do exercise that you enjoy for benefits on your cardiovascular function. She's done a lot of work looking at the effect of menopause on vascular function, so examining premenopausal and postmenopausal women and the effect of exercise training, and she finds it's very protective. I found it very interesting. I think you will too, so stick around. Hi, Ylva. Welcome to Inside Exercise. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Glenn. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we're going to be talking about blood flow, cardiovascular system with exercise, effective acute exercise, exercise training, sex differences, etc. So I'm really looking forward to it. But what I like to do at the start is ask people, how did you get into to exercise research? Were you a sports person and exerciser to start with, and then you got into research, or was it the other way around? So it's kind of a funny one because you wouldn't ask, a cardiovascular researcher, why did you get into cardiovascular research? Did you have a heart attack or something? But it seems to be often the case.
Could have been. Yeah. So I have a pretty funny story where when I was 18, I finished high school. I said, I want to go to the US. And so I did. I didn't have any job or anything. I just left and I went over. And I found a job as an au pair for a year. And then I audited classes. And this was in Amherst, Massachusetts. So there were lots of colleges. And then I ended up actually getting a grant to go to Hampshire College. And when I did that, I also did a bachelor with Priscilla Clarkson, who was at the University of Massachusetts, because you could choose your courses anywhere you wanted. And I did that on muscle soreness. And I realized that my love for sports and my love for natural sciences was a perfect combination. And that's how I got into exercise research and physiology. So I sent my bachelor's thesis directly to Karolinska in Stockholm. And Björn Ekblom and Bertil Sjödin ended up being my supervisors. They said this is perfect because they just had a PhD lined up for muscle soreness and oxygen radicals and what the role was there, and nucleotide metabolism. So I got it directly from bachelor going to PhD. I never did a master's. Wow. And I did 6 years of PhD and many, many methods. So that was my background.
So what was when you went to Amherst, what were you doing? You said you were auditing or something. What was that?
I was an au pair girl, one of those that take care of children for the first year, because I just had to find a job. I didn't have anything. And then I applied to get financial aid from the college and I got it. So I did my bachelor's in 3 years. I didn't do the 101s, but I did in 3 years. And then I directly went to do my PhD. So that's quite a different story.
And were you a sports person as well?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, definitely. I was
I feel like you've been modest or something. What were you? I feel like you've got a bit of modesty or something going on. No,
no, it wasn't brilliant at anything, I think, but I really liked sports. I did a lot of cycling. I did a lot of tennis. I always liked ball sports. Then I played, when I was a PhD student, I did floorball quite extensively, and then I actually became a rower. So I competed in rowing for many years.
Okay. And you are Swedish originally, is that right?
Yep. I am Swedish, yes.
And how long have you been at the University of Copenhagen?
Oh, too long. Probably something like a little over 25 years, maybe 28 years or something like that. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's interesting because I've got a whole bunch of people that I've got as possibles to have on the podcast, and I haven't thought about someone with the eccentric exercise and muscle damage and all that. So it's put an idea in my head. So Priscilla Clarkson was doing the famous sort of 70 forearm contractions. Was she doing that
Yes.
back then to cause muscle damage?
I can't even remember what my job was actually to set up a new method for detecting CKMM, CKMB, CKBB to understand whether that could be used as novel markers. I think that was my bachelor's thesis, something that we did do, but I can't remember how many contractions we did.
Fair enough. I remember reading that.
But it was forearm. It was arm work for sure. Yeah. It was
I was
great
at
work.
David Costel's lab. Yeah, we did the 10 leg extensions, and it would be 120% of your 1 RM. So you'd lift it. You couldn't lift it up because it was more than your maximum, and then you'd have to lower it. But yeah, I remember reading 70 contractions eccentric. It's like, oh, that's going to hurt with your forearm. But just to clarify for people, when you said CKs, that's creatine kinase, which is meant to be in the muscle. It's meant to be in the muscle, but when you do damage, it leaks out. But we're not here to talk about muscle damage. We're here to talk about blood flow and cardiovascular function and things like that, which you're obviously an expert on. Now, I wonder if I was thinking we could sort of go in order maybe. So before exercise even, does anything change with your blood flow and your heart rate and things like that? Then you exercise, what happens during exercise? And then that's acute. And then what about if you do chronic, so training? So can we just start off just to sort of set the scene? So even if you're like on the starting blocks for the Olympic 100-meter final, what's actually happening to your blood flow and your cardiovascular function at that point before the gun even goes?
Yes. So of course, before you begin, if you are used to competing, you are aware of that your heart rate is already increased, and of course this is a central command. So it's your brain, it's your high brain, if you will, that is aware of that you need to be able to run. And evolutionary, that must have been a good point. If you were worried that someone was going to attack you, you were well prepared to make that dash away from anyone who was hunting you or going to hunt you. So that's what happens first, and then of course, as you begin to run, there are sensors, neural sensors also in your muscle, reflexes and mechanical reflexes that influence your cardiac output or the heart's ability to pump out blood. And blood flow will increase very rapidly as you begin to exercise. Blood flow to the muscle. So the muscles that are working are receiving large amounts of blood as you begin to exercise. And it's not fully understood what initiates this. So within seconds, you'll have a rapid rise in blood flow and oxygen delivered to the muscle. And we think that the need for oxygen is what sort of is sensed in the muscle somehow. Now, there are some theories, maybe we should come back to those, but at least that's my gut feeling, that the main issue here is that something in the muscle or possibly in the endothelial cells lining the blood vessels sense oxygen levels, right?
Interesting. Yeah, so
so
we will get to that. So if we just set the scene, so you're saying within a second, and is that if it's low intensity, high intensity resistance exercise, endurance exercise, whatever, maybe, I'm not sure we know that, but within a second, how do they actually measure that out of interest? Or is it sort of in sort of
it's within a second. So Mike Tchaikovsky did some nice studies. Shoemakers done some on the initial phases of exercise and blood flow rises. And actually, what Tchaikovsky did, among other things, is to look at just one single contraction and look at the blood flow response to just one single contraction. We're very good time resolution. But of course, when you measure with ultrasound Doppler, which you can use to assess muscle blood flow, that also allows you to follow very clearly and with good time resolution the change in blood flow as you begin to exercise. So it's not a big deal in one sense. So if you, until I think half of the rise to whatever level of blood flow you get for a given exercise mode is between 2 and 10 seconds or something like that. And then you're asking if you plot them against each other, sort of if you plot a different, if you do one leg knee extensor exercise, which we often use, and you plot these curves on the same, going up, leveling off, going up, leveling off, then you see that the slope of the blood flow increase is sort of steady rising. So yeah, the time by which you go from one intensity to the next is more or less the same as the time as you go from rest to exercise. Does that make sense? So you have sort of a linear increase, up, steady up, and very rapid, both from rest to exercise and between exercise intensities. Making sure that you're always getting the amount of oxygen delivered that is used for energy production for your muscular work. It's a perfect, I mean, it's so well designed. It really works really well.
Right. And I know both of us have done work with nitric oxide, and we'll talk about that as maybe a potential, because it's a vasodilator, it causes dilation and increases in blood vessels. But I remember the classic Radegran and Saltine paper, where they actually showed, so just talking about even, do you need the muscle contractions? Because Radegran and Saltine, I'm pretty sure, showed even just passive movement. So when, you talk about this leg extension, so you're sitting, if people don't know, it's kind of like doing leg extensions, but we call it leg. I'm saying we because I'm in Copenhagen at the moment, we're using that. You're sitting there and you're doing like a leg extension, but they call it like leg kicking, because you do it at a low intensity where you can do it like for an hour if you want. It depends on the protocol. And I think they even like just passively moving the leg, there was an increase in blood flow. I wonder if anyone knows what's going on there.
So yes, that observation is very interesting. Of course, Professor Richardson has followed up on those initial, passive flow changes, passive movement flow changes, and we have also done a bit on it. It's interesting. It's if you block NO there, you see a much reduced increase in blood flow, but there's still an increase. So not all is removed. If you compare older individuals and younger individuals, you'll see that the response is smaller in older individuals than in younger, and probably related to nitric oxide. So some of this passive response is nitric oxide mediated, probably shear stress mediated, I would think, when blood flow. So I would think there was some kind of mechanical, you get a peak and then you get a sort of elevated, sort of steady state level of flow. But this peak, I think, has to do with some mechanical, with the movement itself somehow. And then the following flow, has to do with shear stress induced NO to a large extent. That's what it seems like, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. So just so people are aware that, so nitric oxide, actually, the people that worked out what it was doing in the cardiovascular system won the Nobel Prize in 1998. So nitric oxide is a dilator, and people that have high blood pressure quite often have reduced nitric oxide, so there's less relaxation of the blood vessels, less blood flow. And then you talked about shear stress. So that's an interesting one. So shear stress, I guess, maybe just explain that. And I don't want to go too deep too quickly here, but you mentioned the endothelium. So you've got the blood vessels and you've got the inner cells, which are the endothelium. Maybe just talk a little bit about that in terms of what's happening with blood flow. I mean, you said the passive and then during exercise, but maybe we are getting a bit deep. I can't help myself.
So so when blood flow increases, as you begin to exercise, and they say, okay, there's a signal somehow related to the need for oxygen, and we know this pretty well. I think that's pretty definite. So that signal, we don't know what it is, but blood flow increases, and when blood flow increases, of course, what happens is that in the blood that passes by the endothelial cell layer of the blood vessels, right? It will put a frictional force on the endothelial cells, and the endothelial cells have mechanosensors, so they're able to sense, this frictional force of blood. So the more blood flow you have going to the muscle, the more this frictional force. Now, the response of the endothelial cells to this frictional force, shear stress, is to release vasodilators, so that the lumen of the blood vessels increased, allowing for more blood to flow through without, resistance. So this signal, I think, is the key, and we can come back to that, but it's a key signal in the cardiovascular system. It will, in the end, alter the number of capillaries. It will alter the lumen. If you have a lot of shear stress in the vessels, it will alter the architecture of the blood vessels. But it is also a vasodilatory signal that I think functions sort of as a modulator. So one has to think about that when blood goes to the muscle, what you get is, of course, a rhythmic sort of blood flow, because as the muscle contracts, you will close off blood flow. And then as the muscle relaxes, it will again allow for blood to pass through. So if you look at the blood flow curve, you see it goes up and down like this, in sort of a wave form according to the length of the contractions and the relaxation phase. And that, of course, will induce a lot of sort of shear stress differences. And I think the shear stress sensing plays a role in sort of modulating flow so that it's not too uneven in different situations. Yeah. So I don't think it determines exercise flow, but I think it sort of has a modulating effect. That's my role. It's not usually affecting flow, but it is sort of, yeah.
And how about we think about, so with Eric Richter on last week, he talked about how glucose uptake can increase like 100-fold during exercise.
Yeah.
And naturally, that's going to be glucose extraction plus the blood flow. So how much of an increase in blood, what's kind of like the highest increases in blood flow, do you know, that you get in muscle? So maybe like the whole leg versus muscle. Are we talking about sort of 20-fold, 10-fold, like the rest?
So muscle-specific blood flow is estimated to increase up to 100-fold with intense exercise, going from rest to intense exercise. Okay. If you just look at blood flow to one leg, the whole leg, we have at rest, we have about 0.2, 0.4 liters per minute going to the leg, not so much. And then when you do maximal exercise, if you have a large leg, you can come up to 10 liters per minute. So, but that's, of course, to the whole leg. So that's when we measure in the femoral artery at the upper part of the leg. But if you look at muscle-specific flow, it's estimated that it's about 100-fold increase it can go up to. That's a major change. Yeah. So the interesting thing about skeletal muscle blood flow is, of course, this. There's enormous precision in relation to the need for oxygen, as I say. There's a very rapid rise, as you were talking about, and there is a huge range of flows. So that's why this regulation of blood flow is so complex, I think, because it really has to accommodate all of this, and the precision is very, very good. It's very impressive. That's why we can't figure out quite how it works, as you know.
Now, what about it's funny because I've done quite a lot of blood flow and exercise and NOS inhibition and nitric oxide inhibition and things, but I'm just thinking of things now for some reason. So if you talk about someone getting increasing their blood flow by 100-fold, I guess they need to have the cardiovascular function though to actually deliver that blood, right? So if someone's really untrained, I guess they don't increase their blood flow as much because they don't have as much blood to deliver. Is that right? Or I guess it depends on the exercise.
Well, it depends on how big a muscle mass you're working with. So it's sort of Bengt Saltin's old calculations of how much blood can the heart fully supply. His estimations would say that you can supply about 8 kilos of muscle with full blood, perfusion. So if you do one leg extensor exercise, of course, you don't have a systemic limitation. If you do cross-country skiing, or if you do rowing or whatever, you use a lot of muscle in your activity, and therefore the heart is no longer able to supply it fully. So I would say it's sort of the balance between what your heart is capable to do and how much perfusion capacity you have in the muscle, how much muscle you have, and once this would also somewhere.
That's interesting. Okay, so that's where I guess I start thinking about how the body controls that. So if you can send, because sometimes they talk about this leg kicking, the leg extension, you get sort of like an exaggerated blood flow because I guess you don't have that limitation. You get really high blood flows. But when you're doing sort of like normal exercise, cycling, running, cross-country skiing and things, I guess you've got to have a situation where you're dilating the blood vessels to send in the blood, but you can't have them fully dilated or the blood pressure will drop, right? Because you can't, as you said, you can only perfuse 8 kilograms of muscle fully.
Right.
Is that fair to say?
Right. So what's interesting about exercise and blood flow is also, of course, this need to maintain blood pressure. So I always, at least for my students, I always say that blood pressure is the overall regulating thing. That if you can't maintain blood pressure, you're falling off your bike, right?
Yeah.
So it's really important that the body responds to any changes in blood pressure and make sure that blood pressure is adequate to maintain supply to the brain. And therefore it's a challenge, and it's even more so. It's a challenge to do hard exercise, especially with large muscle mass, and especially in high temperatures where you also need to send blood to the skin. So it's an interesting, integrative model, this with exercise and exercise in the heat. So yes, there is a debate on to what extent you need to contract, do you need to reduce vasodilation, if you will, in the active muscles when you're working with the whole body. And there was this absolutely fantastic study made by Jose Calvé and Bengt Hartin and some other researchers, where they put good Swedish cross-country skiers on the treadmill. I don't know if you've seen this study. It's an amazing study. They did both, diagonal poling and just leg work. And they had catheters everywhere, these guys. And the conclusion of that study was that, yes, when you did that kind of work, it was a constriction was needed, or you would have had too large a drop in blood pressure. But others are arguing that maybe this is not needed, and that was maybe it was standing up, which makes a difference, and it was very severe exercise. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. So that's really interesting. And you mentioned Jose Calvé. He's actually thankfully just agreed to come on the podcast, so he'll be on in a,
good.
in a bit.
Great.
Yeah, they've done a whole bunch of. I think it may have been Bengt Hartin's last study I saw, where they were doing the masters athletes, and they were looking at how they could have such high VO2 maxes, and they were just doing all sorts of things. Pretty impressive. The masters cyclists. So I guess I'm just trying to think how, when we talk about what determines performance, we tend to talk about VO2 max, lactate threshold, economy if it's running, and I guess cross-country skiing. So I guess they're talking about the VO2 max, right? How much blood can they actually deliver in that situation? Because if you're actually trying to limit, delivering too much blood, or your blood pressure will drop, I guess it comes back to the cardiac output, which is pretty much your VO2 max. The other thing I'm thinking about is there's been this controversy. So, you talked about muscle blood flow. So if you just measure the leg, you're using Doppler or something to measure the femoral artery, or you can also measure thermodilution in the femoral vein, where you look at the temperature drop. Just because I'm mentioning, I'll just explain it a bit. So if you infuse cold saline, and then you measure the temperature like 8 centimeters away, if the temperature drops a lot, then it means the blood flow must be low. If the temperature's high, it won't drop as much. So you can measure that. That's like the leg blood flow. You're talking about measuring the muscle blood flow. There's been this controversy about whether all the capillaries are open or not at rest, and without naming names necessarily. Some people were saying the capillaries are open the whole time, and then some of the studies, so the first study I did here, you were involved with, we did the contrast and then ultrasound. It's clear that the capillaries are not all open at rest. Do you want to just talk about, I know you haven't specifically looked at that, but I was just thinking that almost couldn't work, right? Or your blood pressure would just drop if all your capillaries are open at rest.
So you're saying your blood pressure would drop if your capillaries are open at rest? No. So I think this is it's a sensitive matter. Let's put it that way. But I think that have a very good friend in Chris Ellis who has looked at blood flow to the muscle with intravitreal microscopy all his life. And of course, he has also looked at this issue, and they made some modeling on calculated things. And David Poole is the other one who's big on saying that capillaries are not recruited, but they're open. So both Chris and David do say that, and I guess David Wasserman also had a very strong paper on saying that, well, there was no recruitment. And I haven't sat and done it myself, but I've listened a lot to Chris, and he has so much experience at looking at intravitreal microscopy, and he has such a thorough model, making sure that the oxygen content around these preparations is held what it should be, and so forth. So I think I do trust him when he says that this is what's going on. It's not you don't have closed capillaries at rest, but you have a huge variation. So if you look at his videos, it's very clear there's a huge variation in how much that goes through the capillaries. And it's interesting because he's recently published this model of how capillaries are structured in the muscle fascicles, right? So the muscle fascicles, so this bundle of fibers that the terminal arteriole goes into this muscle bundle of fibers and goes parallel along and is coupled to connect them, right? And it's that terminal arteriole and the arteriolar resistance before that will determine how much blood flow goes into each of these capillary units of fascicles. But it will also be the individual resistance, if you will, and the pressure difference for every one of these capillaries that determines how much at rest that goes through one, each of them of red blood cells. So none of them are always secluded. I mean, I can't see that in their preparations, and he has never seen that. It is no indication whatsoever. And I'm not saying that it couldn't be the case, but I think the arguments for why you cannot conclude that there is recruitment of capillaries during exercise with the SOS method, the SOS method is a black box in many ways. And the amount of bubbles you send through the system is so low. It's extremely low. It's like 1 in 6,000 red blood cells or something like that. That's the amount you're sending through. So you cannot say anything about flows. It may just be, that some of the capillaries will not have that one bubble going through,
okay,
and you cannot detect it. So you're looking at volume. So it's nothing wrong with the method, but it's the interpretation of the method that is difficult to know. It's not possible to deduce exactly what does it tell us, but it's unlikely based on these intravitreal microscopy measurements that is actually recruitment we're talking about. But I think we need better methods in humans, at least, to look at this. So I'm not, I'm not selling short everything that's been done with SAVES, because that would be really bad news. But so it tells us something, but it's unclear exactly what it tells us. It's probably more a change in flow than a recruitment, but there are changes, and you can measure that with this. I don't know if that tells you. I'm a little careful to go into, because I have not studied it myself. I just know from the literature and from Chris, who I speak to a lot, and he's a very good friend of mine, and he's such a trustworthy person. Anything he says, I'll trust, because he's just so good at what he's doing. Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about during exercise, you get massive increases in blood flow. And then what about after exercise? So when you stop, does the blood flow go boom, straight back to sort of rest, or does it take a while? And does it depend on the type of exercise and things like that, I guess?
Yeah, so blood flow doesn't go right straight back. It's maintained for a while, a little bit dependent on, as you say, the intensity and the duration of exercise. And it's been found by Halliwell has done some really nice studies showing that the responsible compound here is histamine. So if you give people antihistamines, this will lower the post-exercise blood flow, which is interesting in itself. That says that there's sort of a regulator of this. Other than that, people have suggested that the increase in blood flow is there to, to make sure you supply, replenish oxygen stores or energy stores and so forth to make sure that, everything is back to normal after an exercise bout. There could be temperature differences, there could be things like that. But this histamine aspect is very interesting. It's not quite understood why it's histamine or how it works, so forth, but histamine, of course, induces NO production, and we know that if we block nitric oxide or NO, we reduce that post-exercise flow also quite substantially. I think it's about 50% or something like that. So at rest and recovery, NO inhibition will reduce blood flow substantially, about 40-50%. But during exercise, as you know, nothing really happens if you block nitric oxide. And that has to do, I think, with redundancy. So the system is you have to be able to increase flow, and therefore the system is made up such that you have backup systems. And this has been shown. It could be chemical backups, or it could be, sort of the need for oxygen to make sure that there are other systems to draw on when one is inhibited.
Exactly right. And I meant to actually say that because, again, with Eric Richter last week, we were talking about how if you have, if you knock out AMP kinase, you still have normal glucose uptake during exercise. You block out nitric oxide synthase, you still have normal glucose uptake. So it's like you've got this redundancy because it's so important.
Yeah.
And it's the same with blood flow. Yeah. So I know the classic, I think it was at Bouchel, or it may have been you as well on that. So if you block nitric oxide production during exercise in humans, there's no effect on blood flow. If you block the prostacyclins, did you want to just explain that? And then if you do both.
So Rob Bichel did some studies on it, and we did, and others did too. So if you only block nitric oxide, you have no change in exercise flow. But if you block both the nitric oxide system and the cyclooxygenase system that produces prostacyclin and among other prostaglandins, and which we think also is very important for blood flow regulation, you do get a reduction, not a huge one when it's done in the arm joiners, and it's a sort of a limited, maybe 20% decrease. He shows, depending on how you do the blockades, you can get different results. It doesn't matter so much for this. But so that's why we think this redundancy is there between these two compounds. So if you block nitric oxide, then prostacyclin can take over, but if you block both, you will get some reduction. Now we did triple blockades and so forth, and we don't really get more reduction. So we've blocked adenosine, for example. We blocked EDHF, which is endothelial derived hyperpolarizing factor. I suppose you can do that. And nowhere have we ever been able to reduce exercise hyperemia by more than about 30%. Right? So some of this could be due to the fact that there is what's called functional sympatholysis also during exercise, and functional sympatholysis is the mechanism, again, is not really known, but it's known that a compound like ATP can induce functional sympatholysis. Functional sympatholysis is a reduced constrictive effect of sympathetic activity. So normally when you begin to exercise, not normally in any normal person, when you begin to exercise, sympathetic activity increases. That would make all of your blood vessels constrict, right? Also in the muscles using constriction, but that has to be overcome. And one of the ways you can overcome this is by this functional sympatholysis. So you produce ATP, somehow this blocks the receptor for noradrenaline, and you get a reduced constrictive effect. Exactly, in animals this can be nitric oxide, has been shown, but we can't see that in humans. So that's why we probably cannot reduce flow more than about 30%. So maybe functional sympatholysis plays a major role. And Bengt Santin was very sort of big on this, and Stefan Mortensen, that function supervisors is really important. I think also we don't really understand how these vasodilators interact and work, and we may not know which ones are really the most important. We have some, with nitric oxide, prostacyclin, are two big candidates, but we don't really understand exactly how this works.
I might just make sure people are clear on what we've been talking about here. So people beware of adrenaline. So we're out picking berries when we're hunters and gatherers, and a tiger jumps out, and we get a shot of adrenaline, yeah, and that's going to cause, as you said, sympathetic. Adrenaline is the sympathetic nervous system. That will cause constriction of the blood vessels, so closing them down, right? But then when you exercise, you're saying you get these various things produced like nitric oxide, which is a vessel, and that does this functional sympatholysis. So it actually, olysis means sort of breakdown. So sympatholysis, so breaking down the sympathetic. So it's almost counteracting the adrenaline and allowing the increase in blood flow. Is that fair to say? And
yeah. Noradrenaline, I would say, yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I knew, as I was saying, I said, okay, so it's adrenaline and noradrenaline. But yes, so basically it's the fight or flight, and your body's overcoming that by these agents that allow increases in blood flow. And the good thing, I guess, is that way you're getting increases in blood flow in the muscles that you're contracting, because they're the ones that are producing the nitric oxide. They're the ones that are having the shear stress, and not the muscles that are at rest. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. Because in order to maintain blood pressure, when it's important that you have this constrictive effect. Otherwise, if you allowed all of the blood vessels to open up and all the muscle when you're running, for example, that would be really hard to maintain blood pressure during those circumstances. So this constrictive effect of sympathetic activity as you begin to exercise is important to of course send signals to the heart to pump and so forth. But it's really important for maintaining blood pressure when you do hard exercise, and especially then with, as we talked about before, when you exercise with large muscle groups, you really tax the system. You need to make sure that you're not fainting as you do that. Yeah.
Exactly. I was just trying to think, because I try to think about how to put it in simple terms for people. So if you turn on a tap and you've got this sprinkler system going all over the place, then the pressure is going to be like really low, right? But if you close off some sections, so maybe the muscles that aren't contracting, then the pressure will be, you're able to maintain the pressure more. But if everything was just open, you open the floodgates, so to speak, the pressure wouldn't be enough to sort of water the plants you want to water, which is the muscles.
And this is also true. This is also true, of course, for the internal organs, that if you exercise really hard, then you're closing off your inner organs, gastrointestinal tract, or the blood vessels to keep pressure and blood flow going where it should go.
Exactly. And then to bring it back around to what you said earlier, in the heat, you've got that situation where you're trying to keep it all under balance, but you've got to send some blood to the skin as well for sweating and losing heat to the environment.
But the muscle wins, so that's important. The muscle wins over the temperature regulation, so the muscle will maintain. That's why it's hard to exercise hard in high temperatures.
There you go.
One of the reasons. Cool. Yeah, it's hard for many reasons, but one of the reasons is, yeah.
Right. So I kind of got a bit too early talking about after exercise, but I want to go back to that now. So one thing I'm interested in people, especially because we're talking about blood pressure, I'm not sure if you've looked at this at all, but when you finish exercise, you'll have a bit of what's called post-exercise hypotension, so like low blood pressure. I wonder if you know what's going on there. And the histamine, I meant to say the histamine, that's really interesting because, people think about antihistamines for hay fever and things. But you're talking about after exercise, the blood flow tends to stay up because of histamines. Yeah. So I wonder what's happening there, with the post-exercise hypotension. So, we tell people don't just suddenly stop exercise and then stand there. Do you want to just explain what's going on there a little bit?
So yes. So if you look at the cross-country skiers, this is just an anecdote. But if you look at the cross-country skiers when they come in, when they've done a race and they come in, they often sort of throw themselves on the ground, and that could be because they're tired, but it's also because when the heart has gone at a very high level, right, and you vasodilate, so heart rate goes down rather rapidly when you stop exercising. But the vasodilation is maintained for a much longer time. And this is what we talked about, exercise blood flow. And when you have exercise blood flow being increased, that's because your blood vessels are rather open. And when your blood vessels are rather open, that's one of the two components in blood pressure regulation, right? So because vasodilation, because these blood vessels remain open to the muscle, right? Whereas cardiac output, or the heart's pumping, goes down rather rapidly, then you have a problem with your blood pressure. If you're an athlete, you will have a problem. Rowers, you can see they sit and they might go like this, so to maintain, the head at the heart level. So blood pressure is regulated by cardiac output and total peripheral resistance. That is the resistance of all blood vessels. If you have many blood vessels open, blood pressure is lowered, right? So if you're an athlete, this is a problem. But if you've just done an exercise somehow, just gone running for 30 minutes or something, you stop abruptly, this is what happens also, but to a lesser extent, right? So your heart rate will fall down, your blood vessels will maintain some kind of openness for a while, and therefore blood pressure falls. So therefore it's a good idea to walk after you've run or done something, to maintain some kind of activity, so your heart is not going down too quickly down to resting level, if that's what you're referring to. Yeah. But of course, this is a very good thing for the benefits of exercise, this post-exercise hypertension, which can be maintained for quite some time after exercise, depending on what you've done. It's of course good, because that means if you normally have high blood pressure, then your blood pressure is lower in this phase, which is good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How long does that last? So I want to talk about chronic sort of exercise training, but after each bout, do you have an idea? Are we talking a couple of hours?
I mean, I think it depends on what you've done. Maybe if you cycle for 24 hours, maybe it's over for a long time. So it's a little bit in relation to the intensity and the duration of your work. So I would say normally half an hour after, maybe 2 is probably normally what it is.
Actually, the other thing is I always tend to think of endurance type stuff, and we keep talking about endurance. Do you know, with the blood flow during exercise and the exercise, post-exercise hypotension, low blood pressure, what about do you know if it's resistance training, endurance training? Is there much sort of difference, do you know?
In terms of blood pressure?
I guess it depends how many different muscles you're working with your resistance training, how hard you do it, I guess, as well.
Yeah, so again, so what happens when you do resistance training, if you're talking acutely, is of course that you're closing off blood flow to the muscle. And if you sort of tighten up your inner your stomach muscles, because you're lifting something really heavy and you need to stabilize and so forth, you're closing off everything almost. And blood pressure can rise from your 120/80 to several hundred millimeters of mercury if you're doing really heavy resistance exercise training with big muscle masses. So leg work, for example. So this is, of course, it can be a negative, but it's not very obvious that it does have a detrimental effect. Where it becomes detrimental is if you also eat steroids to become big. Then you have a big problem with many things in the cardiovascular system. But if you just do this and you do it, for training, usually it's not an issue. If you have high blood pressure, I would be very careful to raise that above a certain amount. So, but normal people who do normal strength training, I wouldn't worry about it. And it's a very good thing for people to do.
Actually, interestingly, I don't know if you've heard about this blood flow restriction stuff. I just had a guy, Jeremy Lenecke, on talking about blood flow restriction with weight training and things. So they're literally purposely stopping the blood flow and looking at hypertrophy and things like that. I just maybe wonder if it's worth just talking a little bit. Is it still, my understanding was like once you contract above about 30% of your maximum voluntary contraction, is that when the blood flow is stopped in that muscle, do you know?
I can't remember exactly. I think you would have to do pretty hard exercise. So blood flow restriction is of course localized to, if you were talking about that, then it's localized to wherever you put this thing. I'm not sure it's good for everybody. That's we work quite a bit with blood clot formation and the risk of blood clot formation in people in association with exercise. For healthy people, it's not an issue, but if you have any kind of, tendency for blood clots, I would never do it. But you asked about the normal with constriction. I don't know. I mean, I remember measuring on myself. I measured blood flow as I did, just took my hand and constricted, and I could close off all the blood flow going to the forearm. But I have no scientific data for when it's occluded. Actually, I think you would have to do more than 30%. But yeah, I'm not sure.
As you say, normally endurance is very different, isn't it? Because it's rhythmic contractions, and it may even be less than 30% as well.
Yeah.
But then with strength training, each contraction, if you're doing isometric, again, it depends. If you're doing isometric and you're just holding it, what about the Valsalva maneuver? Do we just, because that's the other thing when you're doing weights, people say, "Oh, keep breathing," but you just naturally, when you're lifting a heavy weight, stop breathing.
So you get so much pressure that for that moment you're pretty much shutting everything down, I'd say.
And your pressure.
But if going back to what you just asked, so of course this rhythmic flow pattern of muscle flow, it will be there at any intensity. So this up and down. So but complete occlusion, if you want that, you would have to go higher than 30%. But even with 10%, you would see a rhythmic, flow distribution problem.
So with this rhythmic thing, maybe we'll just touch on the muscle pump. So if people see, you've got soldiers and I don't know, people standing at attention bands or police bands in the heat or something, you'll see they'll be wriggling. If you look close, you'll see they'll be wriggling their toes a little bit, because if you stand still, you're not doing this. Why don't you just mention the muscle pump business, just so people could understand what we're talking about to help get blood back to the heart.
So it's of course very important to make sure the blood doesn't stay down in the lower limbs. So one of the problems with us, being upright, is of course that we have our brain above the heart, and we have a lot of body below the heart, and gravitation will sort of pull blood down, and veins are very elastic, very flexible, and keep a lot of blood in them. So about 60%, approximately at rest. That means that if you're standing up still, what's going to happen is that the veins, the venous system and the veins is going to be filled with blood. Okay, so and when it gets filled with blood, less blood is being returned to the heart. And the muscle pump is a way by which sort of the muscle contracts around the veins, and some pressure, puts pressure on the veins and sends blood back to the heart. Okay, there are valves in the veins, so there are valves that go one way. So when the muscles contract around the veins, the blood is sent upwards, and the valves make sure that it doesn't go back down. So the regular valves along the veins, the venous system. So contract, send it up, and send it back to the heart. If you stand completely still, you can faint because too much blood is below, stays down in the venous system, and you don't get enough back. So that's why, sometimes you see soldiers that are standing guard, falling over or whatever. And that's also why if you walk slowly and go in museums, I say, people get maybe swollen feet, and this also has to do with that fluid comes out at the because of this high backup of blood in the venous side. This has an implication for filtration of fluid from the capillaries, and that's why they sort of become swollen.
I remember when I was young, I used to run a lot, like I was a serious runner, but then I couldn't go shopping for the life of me. So if I was just walking around slowly, like shopping, it's like, oh, my calves would be hurting and everything. It's just like, you're meant to be fit. I said, well, I can run, I just can't walk, So it's like going to a museum, I guess, like walking around the shops, and everything. Okay, so what about chronic? Sorry?
Yeah, so I have it the same way. I have a hard time standing still. So I don't like, my body doesn't like standing still or walking slowly. I can't do
We're
that.
actually meant to keep moving,
Keep
I guess.
going.
All right. So what about chronic? I know you've done a lot of exercise, and we've been leading to this. So exercise training effects on, blood pressure, blood flow. I know you've done a lot of studies looking at sex differences and all sorts of things. Why don't you tell us what happens to, I guess, start with blood pressure, maybe with exercise training and
Yeah, so if you train people that are previously untrained, you can do almost any kind of exercise intervention, and you will, have a drop in blood pressure of a few millimeters of mercury within 8 weeks, 3 months, something like that. There are many studies that show this. Even walking would lower your blood pressure if you do it regularly for a period of time. So exercise has a very, it's very pronounced, very clear effect on lowering blood pressure. And then you can ask, why is that? What are the mechanisms underlying that reduction in blood pressure? So one of the things that plays a role for blood pressure regulation is how much resistance there is, as we talked about before. So you have your cardiac output, you have your total peripheral resistance. And resistance has to do with two things in one sense, but one main thing I think that plays a role for blood pressure and the effects of exercise is how constricted all of your blood vessels are, or arterial blood vessels are at, in any given situation. So the more constricted they are in a given situation, the more resistance there is in the system, right? So microvascular regulation is in one sense the same systems that regulate blood flow. So nitric oxide, prostacyclin function, to some extent, some functional superlysis. If you're exercising, this reduction in sympathetic activity or reduction in the effect of sympathetic activity on the constriction. All these factors, if you're untrained, these become worse and worse. They don't work as well. And on the other side is, if you then train, you improve all of these systems that are meant to work very well. So as you say, you're meant to be active in a day. And one of the reasons is that if you're active in a day, and not enormously, but if you just keep active to some extent, you can maintain these systems working in the way they should. And if you're inactive, they will deteriorate with time. So if we look at aging, for example, and we look at people who, both men and women, who have been active all their lives at different levels or completely inactive, there's a huge difference in how well these systems function, right? So age has an impact, but I would say close to half of the effect of what people say is aging is actually inactive aging as opposed to active aging. That's how much of an influence. I don't think people realize how much the cardiovascular system deteriorates if you are too inactive. And we're not talking about if you have to run marathons. Almost, as I say, walking can make a difference, moving around in a day, cycling every once in a while, if you can do that, doing whatever you can will have an impact on all this and send the right signals. So internal mechanical signals, we talked about shear stress and chemical signals to keep these systems maintained as they should. I think that's how I would say. So we've done, quite a few studies, and they all show the same thing. And you could say, what's the most optimal then way of training to maintain the system functioning? And I say, whatever you can do, and I think that's what Eric Richter also usually says, whatever works for you is the most optimal way. Because even if I recommended something and people said, okay, fine, Ylva says this and this, but I hate doing that and that, then it doesn't work, then it's useless information. So find something that makes sense for you, that is fun, that is good, it's actually the best recommendation. If you were to ask me, but I still want to know, I would say that we have been very successful with sort of high intensity aerobic interval training, not the sprint kind of training, but the high intensity aerobic interval training. And one of the reasons I say that it shouldn't be necessarily sprint training is because we see with capillarization, which has a very large impact, the number of capillaries you have in a muscle plays a role, among other things, for oxygen delivery and nutrition, but it also appears to be important for insulin sensitivity and development of type 2 diabetes, right? So you want a fair number of capillaries, and very high intensity exercise doesn't seem to promote capillarization. On the other hand, it may even have a negative impact. So I would stay with sort of intensive aerobic exercise, where you tax the system, but you don't overdo it, and you maintain a volume at time, that could maybe correspond to at least this 30 minutes or whatever, where you do this. So we often train people with the spinning training, with cycling, we do maybe 45 minutes of different intervals types, where you go from one to next, and then you pause, and then you go again. This is very effective for all cardiovascular parameters we've ever measured.
Okay, so just to clarify for people, so with the high intensity aerobic, so you're not talking about the sort of 30-second sprints and then recovery, but you're talking about, it could be something, classic stuff was sort of like 4 or 5 minute intervals with maybe 2 or 3 minute recovery, or do you do sort of 1 minute on,
it could
1
be
minute
anything.
off, or
So the rule from P.O. Ostrand, who was one of the classical exercise physiologists, was always, twice the amount of work as the break between, right? So you could do 2 minutes of exercise, 1 minute of break, 3 minutes of exercise, 1.5 minute of break. Any of those 2, 3, 4, minutes of intervals, or grading it so that you start and you go up and up and up. That's what we usually do in spinning. You go, okay, now we'll push it a little more, and then we push it a little more. The other thing that has been very effective is Jens Bangsbo's 30, 60, 90 version of running, where you go, 30 minutes all out, more or less, 30 seconds, all out, 60 seconds moderate, and then, you go at a low intensity for 90.
okay, and then you repeat that.
And you repeat that, yeah. You can, yeah.
I guess the point is, if people go, oh, well, I can't do a minute, because people often, I find when you talk about interval training, they just go too hard. So they go, oh, I can't go a minute hard and then go again 30 seconds later. Well, you get, because your minute hard is too hard. And the same if you do, oh, I can't do 3 minutes hard, and then just slow it down. You don't have to go nuts.
Yeah.
And as you say, we don't want to actually complicate things too much. So you don't have to worry, is it, oh, I did 66 seconds, not 60 seconds or whatever. It's just basically pushing it, breaking it up a bit. Yeah.
And I think interval training is good because you focus. So even if you're just walking, it's good to do interval walking. So you say, okay, now, because then you concentrate. So if you're just rambling on and talking, it's nice. It's good, of course. But if you take some of the time while you're walking and say, okay, now for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to do some intervals. I'll push myself for a minute, and then I go a little slower again, and then I'll push myself for a minute. And these kind of things are very good because it makes you think about what you're doing, and it puts some focus in, and it gives some intensity. So even just walking like that is useful. Anything you can do, anything you enjoy. Yeah.
And you being a Swede, the Swedish came up with fartlek, right? So the speed.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right.
So where you might go, I'm going to run to that next pole and then jog to the stoplights or whatever. So it's not so structured. Right. Now, one thing I've been thinking about is people may get a bit confused with because when you talk about cardiovascular, a lot of people just think of the heart, the cardio. So it's the heart and the vessels. And I'm just reminded a bit. So when you're talking about with exercise training, because with I had Ben Levine on here, and he was saying, walking is great for your sort of metabolic fitness and things like that, but you need to do something a bit more intense to get the heart adaptations. So, increases in your left ventricle mass and things like that. Did you want to just talk a little bit, because, you were saying walking is good enough for the blood vessel responses. Do you want to sort of break that down a little bit for people, just to sort of, so they think, hang on, cardiovascular. So what do I need to do for my heart? What do I need to do for my vessels? Do I get both if I do this? Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's where I say that gets to be very complicated, because of course you can argue that it's better to do, 60 minutes of or rather intensive exercise until you almost fall down to do that every day. But it depends on your initial level. It depends on your mentality, and it depends mainly on, as I said, whether you do it or not. Because it doesn't really matter if you don't want to run, you won't. You can do it for 3 months and then you stop because you think this is just not me, and I'm getting pain in my knees and I'm doing this and this. So I'm more a promoter. I know that some things are a little better than other, and I know that some more intensive exercise is better than if you do very low intensive exercise. But I don't care. If somebody asks me, Ylva, what should I do? I say, you do anything you can find that you enjoy. Play tennis, go dancing, do as much as you can in a day. Make sure that you go to things or cycle to things or put it into your daily activities. And I'm sure that's going to make a difference for your cardiovascular system. You know, in relation to lying on the couch and saying, well, I can't run anyways, so I'm not going to do anything. So you ask, you tell me what's better. It's better to move around, because anything you do is going to start sending signals. Anything you do in terms of physical activity. And if you enjoy it, you'll have all the other benefits of doing something that you really enjoy. So if you love tennis, play tennis as much as you can. Or if you love biking, go biking and find a nice place to bike. Or if you love running, you run. But people are different, and there's no need, to make things boring. Often social activities, you do together with others is also a really good thing. I mean, we have people here who do social sciences and so forth, psychologists, who are excellent at trying to study people and figure out what are the barriers, what make people want to do exercise, and there are all sorts of things you can do. There is no limit in my mind to what you can figure out to do. Just move that body. So I am a little reluctant to say, well, you have to do 30 minutes and you have to have your heart rate at a certain level. I say no, because that's not for everyone. I know so many people who will never be able to do that for a long time.
Totally agree. I still can't help though with my scientific hat on. So just trying to put together, so I guess, are we saying if you do higher intensity stuff, you'll get the cardiovascular and the blood vessel effects, but maybe at the lower intensity, you'll still get that shear stress and that nitric oxide production by the endothelial cells, that line the blood vessel. So then you'll get a bit of a drop in blood pressure. Say someone's got a normal blood pressure 120 on 80, and then as you age, you tend to increase blood pressure, as you said, because your blood vessels become less elastic, etc., but also because you're not as active. And you were saying, I guess you said 50% or so of the increase in blood pressure is from the inactivity. Is that what you said on stage?
No, not the increase in blood pressure, but about when we look at vascular responsiveness, for example, so we can do that by putting catheters into people, infusing vasodilatory compounds, and look at what's the response, so the vasodilatory response to this compound. And we do that in people different ages and with different training status. Then we can see that a large proportion of the decline in this ability to respond to a vasodilator is due to inactivity. So not the blood pressure per se, but aging does have an effect regardless of blood pressure.
So the blood vessels are becoming less elastic, I guess, less responsive. Well, we've talked about the endothelium, right? So the endothelium is producing nitric oxide, for example, and you infuse like a drug, for example, acetylcholine, that causes nitric oxide release, and you see the effect on the blood flow. So when you give the acetylcholine, if you've got nice healthy endothelial cells, blood vessels, that will cause relaxation and you get a nice increase in blood flow. The other thing you do is you infuse nitric oxide itself, so a nitric oxide donor like sodium nitroprusside, and that bypasses the endothelial cells and just directly acts on the smooth muscle to cause relaxation. So, as you and I have both done a lot, we say, okay, so what's actually happening there? So as you get older and less active, your blood vessels don't respond as well. Is it just the endothelium, so the cells around in the inside layer of the blood vessel, or is it also smooth muscle? Because I know there's been a bit of a debate about people with diabetes if they have. Yeah,
that's right. So I would say that endothelial function has been investigated substantially, in the way we do it and the way other people do it. Smooth muscle cell function has been much less studied. And it's generally studied, as you say, by infusing a sort of nitroprusside, which is an donor, and then you look at the response. What that tests is the smooth muscle cell sensitivity to nitric oxide. And that normally doesn't change very much. There's a few studies that show changes, but usually that's not a factor. But then I would like to say that's just one aspect of the smooth muscle. The sensitivity to endo may not change, but there could be a wealth of other things. So one of the things we've done in the Copenhagen Women's Study, for example, is we've infused a compound called epoprostenol, which is a prostacyclin analog. And that one is severely reduced already 3 years after menopause in women. That's a huge difference. And if we train these women, it's very drastic, but in just 3 months of training them by spinning training, we see that their response to prostacyclin is normalized. So this is a factor that it's ignored. We've done it in other studies and so forth. The prostacyclin system, I think, has been overlooked a bit in terms of blood flow regulation and importance in vascular functions, because we see often that system is very effective. Just to say that the smooth muscle cell is not being well enough studied yet. So we actually have a postdoc here that is studying smooth muscle cells. She's isolating smooth muscle cells from muscle biopsies of people before and after training, diabetics and others. And she looks at their properties a bit in terms of mitochondria, energy production, and so forth. And I think this needs to be done better to be able to answer your question of whether smooth muscle cell function is deteriorated. I'm sure it is more than we now think based on just the sodium nitroprusside test.
Okay, great. So based on yes, so what you're saying there is that the exercise training can improve function. It may be not just the endothelial cells around the inside of the blood vessel, but the smooth muscle, which is actually, so just so people know, like when we're talking about constricting, it's the muscles contracting. So it's this smooth muscle contracting to make it narrower, or if it's relaxing. So that's the important thing that's actually determining your blood flow, yeah?
Yeah, so they're integrating all the signals. They're integrating the signals from nitric oxide, from prostacyclin, from the sympathetic activity, from everything. It's a multi-integrator of signals.
Yes.
To make sure that the goes right.
So we've kind of tiptoed around it and everything, but tell me, what have you looked at? So with the Copenhagen Women's Study, et cetera, so you've looked at before and after menopause, et cetera. What have you found in these women when they go to post-menopause? And then what have you found the exercise training does, again, just to clarify that?
Yeah, so we started this in 2013, also with Eric Richter was part of it, and several others. Because we figured that there wasn't enough data in women, and this is the truth. I mean, we have mainly studied men in physiology, and we started this Copenhagen Women's Study to look at different aspects in women and how they responded to training. And the idea here was to sort of match them in a way that they were late premenopausal and recent postmenopausal. So there were just an average 4 years of difference in age between them, even if they had a very clear sort of sex hormone status that showed that they were even premenopausal or postmenopausal. We didn't have any in the peri phase, or the between phase, if you will. And what we did is we trained both groups 3 months by cycle exercise, spinning training, interval training. And we looked at a number of parameters, the heart and the vessels, and metabolic issues and so forth. But anyways, just to stay with the cardiovascular aspect. So what we saw was that with just these four years of difference in age and 3 years of being on average in a menopausal state, we saw a substantial difference in vascular function. So already within these 3 years of losing estrogen, the vascular function had deteriorated. So the reason for this is probably because we know that estrogen has a protective effect on the cardiovascular system, right? So for the first half of a woman's life until they're about 50, before they enter menopause, you have a protective effect, you have less risk of cardiovascular disease and so forth. But then as you go into menopause, you lose all of your estrogen, and therefore you lose this protective effect. And the influences that are quite drastic on many parameters, cardiovascular system, muscle, bone, many things are affected when you go into menopause. So our idea was, can we see this difference at the microvascular level, which we looked at, and can we sort of oppose this by exercise? And that's exactly what we saw. You can't oppose all of the effects of estrogen loss, of course you can, but exercise was a good way because it sends some of the same signals as estrogen does. That was sort of the idea. And what we saw was when these women trained, they improved significantly and in just these 3 months. So both groups, both the premenopausal and the postmenopausal, improved, but actually the postmenopausal even had, better effects, if anything, on some of the parameters. And they did the same amount of work. So that was quite good. And then this should be added to this, was that this is partly based on American studies from Doug Seal's lab and Carrie Moreau's lab that show, and very clearly and very nice studies and reliable studies, that show that when they train women less rigorously than we do, they don't get a positive response in flow-mediated dilation. So that's a test of large artery function, if you will, right? Whereas men in the same age did. When they gave them estrogen, they saw an improvement also in the women, right? So when we did our study, we saw that for the parameters that we measure and with the training that we gave them, which was more rigorous, they had sort of walking, I think, at home, or they did some kind of sort of intensive walking, if you will. And we did, of course, highly controlled spinning exercise, where intensities are substantially higher. So we saw clear effects. They didn't really see effects unless they gave estrogen at the same time. So maybe sort of more intense exercises needed.
Is it partly the flow-mediated dilatation? I read a few places here and there. Maybe it's not the best way of measuring endothelial function. So this is where you stop flow. Do you want to just explain what it is compared to, I guess, what you're doing with fusing?
So flow-mediated dilation is the response you get. So you usually use the forearm, but you can use the, leg also. You occlude flow, and then you look at the after post-occlusion sort of change in diameter of a brachial artery, for example. And so, of course, this is not where it's an indicator of endothelial function. It's been used as a clinical indicator because it's non-invasive and it's good in that way. And it does correlate to some of these clinical indications of changes in cardiovascular health. But physiologically, I think, I'm not sure what it means. You would have to assume that whatever occurs in that large artery, which doesn't regulate flow, is the same as occurs in the microcirculation, where you do regulate flow and blood pressure and all these things. So that assumption would have to be there. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But it's a useful indicator. It's just not so physiologically clear what it actually reflects. Then we followed up on these. We've done a number of studies, cross-sectional studies in women that have been lifelong active and moderately active, very active, moderately active and inactive, and looked at these parameters, seen, does it affect? And we see that there's a clear difference. If you've been very active, again, this kind of, almost 50% difference compared to those who are inactive in terms of vascular function or microvascular function. So right. And also looking at the women that are older and soon after menopause and later on. And an important finding there is actually that if women are, more than 10 years after menopause, we don't see the same. See, some of the improvements with training are the same, but not all. So it's better. So recommendations should always be to start exercising at menopause, or if you haven't before, at or soon after menopause, rather than waiting too long. I think actually this is true for men too, but we just haven't done the study yet.
Okay, all right, that's interesting. So again, it's just better to be doing the exercise the whole time.
It's
it's
better not to
start
deteriorate. Yeah, so once your sort of age-induced deterioration really sets in, once you've come too far, it's harder to reverse rather than to maintain beforehand. You see the point? So if you keep the system working well, it's better than waiting until it's deteriorated too much and then try to reverse that. You could do it early on, but you may not. Yeah.
I wonder if there's any protective effect. So, we know that Olympians and things live longer on average. I wonder if there's a protective effect of exercising, for many, many years. And then if you stop, I wonder if your blood vessels and things are better, or you go back to someone who never exercised.
I think you have a better, we have a better point. So you're keeping at a higher level. So even if you somehow you get injured, completely injured, you couldn't do anything anymore, you would still be at a higher level. So it would take longer to, so even if the fall is the same, you would still, maintain a better level for a long time. You see that point?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. All right, so this is great. I want to just have a look at a couple of Twitter questions, if that's okay. So Mark sent through, okay, so he's talking about whether so resistance, aerobic, sprint, HIIT, and isometric training all decrease resting blood pressure. How does the mechanisms differ between exercise modalities, even though they all seem to sum up to decrease resting blood pressure? Do mechanisms exist on an exercise continuum? I guess we touched on this a bit earlier. You can end up, even though it's very different, you end up with relatively similar. I guess the mechanisms must be a little bit different.
And I think that this is true mainly for people who are more or less sedentary from the start. As I said, it's almost, you can also get capillarization with almost anything you do if you're untrained from the start. So it's like the cardiovascular system. If you're a sedentary person, it's just sitting there waiting, give me some stimulus and I'll do anything to improve myself. To understand, to fully know the mechanisms and the differences with these types of training, I don't think I dare to go there, because I think there would be differences, in what underlies the effect. But I think that's quite complex, especially for so many different versions of of training.
Yes, yeah, and your starting level, and even if you said resistance training, it would depend if it was like circuit type training or heavyweight training.
That's right. Yeah. It might be different.
Muscle mass and
and where you're at when you're starting, as you say. Yeah, and if so there are so many factors in that'd be difficult to answer.
This one again might be a bit hard to answer, but David is asking, based on your work in healthy and diseased, young and older, male and female, if we have 30 minutes, 3 days a week, sounds like a busy man here. If you had 30 minutes, 3 days a week for dedicated aerobic training, what would have the most optimal use of time? All HIIT or moderate intensity continuous training, a mix? So I guess, again, HIIT, you were saying earlier, you don't want to do really high intensity. You wouldn't want to do sprint. Is that right? But again, do what you want to do.
Do what you want to do. I always say, because I'm a rower, but because when you row, there are two good things about rowing. So if you have a rowing machine at your gym, I think that's a really good cardiovascular training device. And the reason for that being that injury levels are low as long as you row correctly, so your back doesn't get injured, or unless you fall off your rowing ergometer, you're not easily getting injured in rowing, which you can when you run. So if you're not so used to it, it doesn't matter really how much you weigh. So when we train people who are obese, rowing is a really good one because you're keeping your weight on this device. But one of the main aspects why rowing is really good for cardiovascular training is because you're using so many muscles. So you're using, it's about 70% leg and it's about 30% upper body. and you're using everything you have. So I mean, I still row maybe 4 or 5 hours a week on my rowing ergometer. I have one in my house. I love it. It really is so good, you know, overall good. So if someone asked me what kind of training is the best, I'd say that one. What type of intensity, that's what we talked about before. I think interval training, if you can do that in any form, variations in terms of intervals, you have, you know, you warm up, and if you have 30 minutes, you warm up for maybe 10 minutes, and then you go for 1, 2, 3 minute intervals with half of the time for pauses between. I think this will give you incredibly good workout in half an hour.
Yes, and the other thing I was thinking is when you mixing it up, I used to find when I was a runner, just going the easy runs or whatever, I found it was boring. But when you do intervals, you break it up, the time goes quicker as well, I find.
It does go quicker, and it's the concentration. I think, you know, I really, you don't sort of it's easy to soft up, you know, you go running and you have your music, you go a little, you don't go, okay, I have 30 minutes, I'm going to do this now, and this is what I focus on. I fully focus on what I need to do, and you give it quality as opposed to just getting time passed.
Yes.
So for effectiveness, but again, do whatever you think is fun. Yeah.
Okay. Richie's asked a more sort of, I guess, research related question, but what methods do you think show the most promise for assessing limb blood flow during exercise? Anything that can be used during dynamic exercise and is non-invasive, e.g. thoughts on diffuse correlation spectroscopy, which I'm not familiar with, but I guess non-invasive. So we've talked about various, I guess there's some non-invasive things are still expensive. So, you know, we talked about infusing.
Yeah, that's right. So the ultrasound Doppler will be the best, I think, in doing heavy exercise. I think the thermal dilution is still the best that Bengt Heltin developed with infusion of cold saline, as you talked about, because when you come up to very high intensity exercise, it's hard to do the ultrasound Doppler in a good way. You can't keep the probe very easily in place. But for non-invasive, that's invasive. So in non-invasive, I think the ultrasound Doppler is the best, but it's very expensive. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, depends on how reliable what you're going to use it for.
People, I don't know if you know, but I haven't really looked into that.
Yeah, I know about it, but you can measure blood flow as such to in a very good way. Not yet. There's still a bit of a black box also that. Yeah, it's not so clear cut. I think strain gauge plethysmography could be a version. I know people like that one, and it's quite good. It's old fashioned, but it doesn't mean that it's not good. I know that Mike Joyner has also talked about that. That's a pretty decent method. I haven't used it myself, so I don't know.
When we first looked into measuring blood flow to do with glucose uptake during exercise across the leg and arm and things, we looked at venous occlusion plethysmography, but I thought there's an artifact. You've got to, when you're contracting, you've actually got to stop to do the measurement. I don't think you can actually do it during exercise. Sure.
Yes.
Now you gave a talk a few weeks ago, and I think I asked you this question. I don't remember the answer, but basically, I'm interested in people with type 2 diabetes. It's well known they have normal glucose uptake during exercise. Right? So even though they have problems with their insulin-stimulated glucose uptake, they have normal glucose uptake during exercise. And we did a study with them, you know, infusing nitric oxide synthase inhibitors and things like that. But the interesting thing was we found that even though they have normal glucose uptake during exercise, they had lower blood flow at the same absolute and relative intensity. And again, I don't know if you've thought about this or not. I asked you at a conference 2 weeks ago, and I can't remember. Oh, it was probably a couple of months ago now, wasn't it? Do you have any ideas about that? Because that's sort of, because we also showed they had reduced endothelial function. So we infused acetylcholine at rest and sodium nitroprusside at rest, and we showed they had endothelial dysfunction. Their blood flow didn't increase as much with these dilators. But then we exercised them, and they actually had normal glucose uptake, but they achieved it with like quite a lot lower. Like the blood flow was like in the leg was, I think, about 3.5 liters per minute in the controls. And the people with type 2 diabetes, it was about 800 mils or something, like decently lower. Yeah. So it meant they were actually having to. No, maybe that's wrong. It was about 500 5 liters, I guess, versus, and then 800 mils. It was decent. 800 mils. It was lower.
5 liters. That's a lot. That's maximal exercise.
Ah, crap. Okay, I have to have a look at it. Anyway, it was very significant. It was a big chunk. I can show you later.
So it's not something we usually see. So we've even had people with extreme peripheral arterial disease who have the same exercise flow response, more or less.
At the same workload?
So So it's kind of,
really?
So I'm a little surprised. In fact, we always say that the most resilient systems of all is blood flow during exercise, because it's usually, pretty good. But in aging, you see a decline, not that marked as you seem to indicate here, but it's there. For you to, you would have, if you have the same glucose uptake, the only explanation for that is that you have then an increased oxygen extraction, or that the flow you're working at is not limiting for glucose supply, which could also be the case, right? So whatever flow the diabetic patients are having is enough to supply the glucose.
Exactly.
So
it was interesting. We had them at 60% of VO2 max, and we actually matched their VO2 max. So at 60%, they were at the same absolute and relative intensity, and the blood flow was, I'm sure it was like 600 mils low. It was decent, but like as you say, it means they were extracting more oxygen because they ended up using the same oxygen, so they were extracting more and they were extracting more glucose. But anyway, sounds like it's a bit of an anomaly. But we did use thermodilution, and it did look pretty tight. I'll show you later.
I'm sure. Yeah, you can show me the data, but we know that the capacity to increase oxygen extraction is pretty good, at least in muscle, and compared to the heart that doesn't have that capacity to increase it a lot. So there is room there. So if you pharmacologically lower blood flow, what's going to happen is that oxygen extraction is going to increase, right? Or you will increase flow actually. So depending on the experimental situation, we can see both effect. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm wondering about other things you might be working on that you're excited about at the moment. We've talked about this endothelial dysfunction, and I see you've done research on that. So you've been looking at reactive oxygen species production in them. You've been looking at mitochondrial dysfunction in there, and you've even looked at short-term supplementation with fermented red clover extract, reduces vascular inflammation. Do you want to just tell us about some of the work you've been doing?
So what we're trying to do, and it's not so easy, but of course when people look at endothelial function, often what in cell culture, often what they use is human umbilical vein cells, that have been passaged many times, or they use bovine aortic cells, so they use cell lines or whatever. But we thought it would be a good idea to try to isolate endothelial cells from skeletal muscle biopsies, so that you have primary cells that are human, but that also originate actually from the microcirculation of muscle. And so that's what we've spent many years on trying to optimize that method, and have been successful at that actually, with all the limitations there are in isolating small numbers of cells from a very small muscle sample. There's always limitations in all models. This one has its limitations too. But what we do there is we do look at mitochondrial function to understand how the energetics on the endothelial cells and the ROS production by mitochondria may influence endothelial function such, but also capillary growth, angiogenesis. There's a suggestion that there's a switch in glycolysis to mitochondrial function, when you go towards more glycolysis, when you get capillarization. So we've been trying to look at this. It's not so clear cut in our hands. We see that individuals with hypertension have more ROS formation in their endothelial cells, for example. We see that when we train people, the antioxidant capacity, that is the ability to take care of reactive oxygen species, is improved. So even if these are cells that have been isolated and cultured prior to measurement, they maintain some of the phenotype that can be seen. Some is certainly lost, in part because there's no mechanical impact on these cells that can be, you can't reproduce that perfectly in vitro. But we can see differences and we can see effects of training, and that's kind of, I think that's very interesting. In women, endothelial cells from women, we have seen that actually ROS production is lowered in the endothelial cells, which means something in ultimately for NO nitric oxide bioavailability, right? So if the endothelial cells produce a lot of ROS, it will react with nitric oxide and reduce the amount of nitric oxide available for vasodilation.
Okay, great. So just to make sure people are clear on this, so you're doing a muscle biopsy, and these endothelial cells we've talked about, which line the inside of the blood vessels, you're actually grabbing some of those, isolating them, putting them in culture, like in a cultured dish sort of thing. And then you're saying that they maintain some of their same function that they have in vivo in the body. And you find that, for example, that exercise training increases. So you said you get reactive oxygen species, which can interact with the nitric oxide, which is important for dilating. And the reactive oxygen species is sort of taking that away, basically. You're saying that the training is reducing that, reducing the reactive oxygen species.
It's improving the antioxidant capacity. So that means that you can remove the reactive oxygen species maybe before they're reacting with nitric oxide.
Perfect. So you're saying, because we know that exercise training increases antioxidants, in the muscle fibers. You're saying in the endothelial cells as well, per se, in the cells. Great. Okay, I didn't know that. Nice.
It hasn't been done before. I think it's the first time ever, actually. At least in human cells.
That's very interesting. So when you're exercise training, you're improving your ability to handle these free radicals or reactive oxygen species in the muscle itself, but also in the blood vessels, which are perfusing the muscle, which is very important. Wow, that's great. All right. Now, one thing I ask people sometimes is, they say, oh, here's Ylva Hellsten, full professor. She's got all these papers. It must be that every study you ever do works, right? It all works great, and you submit it to Nature and off you go, So I'm just joking. The Nature part's hard. I guess what's good for maybe students and even people that aren't researchers to know is that experiments, well, you tell me, do your experiments always work? Is that how science works? Like your hypothesis comes true?
No, but I always say that if I knew from the start what I would find, that I'm not going to do the study. So if I'm so sure of what the outcome is, I can't see the point. So I'm an explorer. And I also say that for sure, many times we do studies and we have this thinking, is like, okay, this is our hypothesis, may work, may not, and we see something completely different. And that's where it's really interesting. Exactly. So that's where the goal lies, is when you sit there and you look at these data that you thought, you had some ideas, you thought this was probably going to happen, not sure whether it happened, but then you see something completely different and you go, wow, what lies of information in this absolutely different, set of results than I had ever expected. I think that's the best thing of science, is when you get that. Yes, that's great. It's not what I thought, but it's great. It's different. Let's figure out why it is different and what makes it different. So no, you set up a hypothesis to have something to work for. But as I said, if you already knew pretty much, all right, I'll do the study and I'll show that this is for sure, and I'm pretty sure, that's too boring for me. I don't want to, I don't want to do that kind of research.
Exactly.
So I like the challenge. I like the difficulty. I like finding out that it's not at all like I thought it was. And that's really where I think it's fun. So no, a lot of things don't go as planned. And when you do human experience, you have to be aware of that. There are so many limitations, of course, in having humans as opposed to having cell culture or animals that don't have a say. They get sick, they get bored, they don't do what you want, they eat something before without telling you. There are so many aspects in humans, and the biological variation is huge, because if they lived for 60 years before we measure them, there are so many things that have gone on in their lives that you will see very diverse, very individual results, which is also exciting, which is the truth when we look at humans, but it can make life difficult in terms of interpretation, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like what you said there, because about the exciting things are when you get results you didn't expect, and it's so important not to keep a closed mind and think, oh, that's weird, and just forget that. Because quite often it's when you follow that you end up with a whole new series of questions and a whole new area that people haven't looked at. That's great. All right. So what I'd like to do at the end here is to, have we covered pretty much everything? Is there anything you're itching to get out that we haven't talked about?
I think we've covered a lot. Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. We tend to do that. Okay, so I'd like to finish up with sort of bottom line key takeaway sort of points that you'd like people to get out of this chat. What do you think?
So what are the bottom line? Well, I think so. It's obvious when I talk properly that I do promote exercise, because I know how much, with all the work I've done during 30 some years in research, I have the information in my head, that people will not have. But I would like to say that I really promote being as physically active as anyone can, without overdoing it, of course, but to the level that you can handle, because it has such a huge impact on the cardiovascular system. And the cardiovascular system is so central for functions of all organs. And we really think that this is a systemic issue. If you begin to have cardiovascular problems, you probably affect all organs: the brain, the heart, the muscle, whatever, all of the organs. And I also think that people really, should think about doing something that they like, as opposed to thinking of this as a horror, because I think everybody can do that. What else? I think we should be very observant of that women and men are different. There are some sex hormonal differences, there are other differences, and that we should invest more time into specifically looking at the sex differences, not just saying that everything should be done in women, but thinking more about what's specific for men, what's specific for women. So right now, actually, we're doing a pretty large study trying to assess the influence of testosterone and androgen receptors for training responses in men. That has been done. Some of that has been done before, but we're doing on a fairly large population to understand also in men. So it's not to say that everything from now should be done in women, but it's important to think about how they differ, and therefore also to look at aspects, physiological aspects in relation to that. That's about it, I think. Yeah.
I think. Yeah, the interesting thing there with the sex differences, etc., is I had Abby Smith Ryan on 6 months ago or something, and it was a real mind shift for me, because I would always think of sex differences of comparing a man to a woman, but obviously you've got the interest in the woman themselves, like pre-menopause, post-menopause, effective menstrual cycle, contraception, etc. And then you've got the men themselves. It doesn't have to be always just comparing.
No.
So that was, it's obvious when you said it, but I didn't really think about that properly. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on and for your time. It's been great. And I'll see you in the corridor later on. Okay. Thank you.
See you. Bye-bye now. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please like, subscribe, pass it on to your friends and colleagues. Check out the other podcasts. Thanks again.